Welcome to Sleepover with Yuri. If you've ever been categorized as a minority, whether for being an immigrant or LGBTQ or a person of color, well, guess what? You are in a majority on my show. As Sleepover with Yuri is a show that celebrates diversity, promotes equality, raises awareness, empowers minorities, and spreads love. Also, what my show does, it fights stigma. And there is so much stigma around sex. Why there's so much stigma around something we all love so much, and especially around sex work and sex industry? Why have sex? When have sex? Who have sex with? And do we need to have sex for money or charge for that? I want to ask all these questions tonight and find the answers with my dear friend who is a former hustler, a professional lover, who is a sex worker activist and a published writer, Dale Corvino. Hey, Dale.
Hey, Yuri. Thank you for having me.
My pleasure. Thank you for coming. This is a very interesting subject, and I think not only for me, but for a lot of people, I think we all love to hear or to talk about sex.
Sure.
Especially behind the closed doors. So thank you for coming over and agreeing to talk about it so openly.
Of course.
When I met you and you mentioned that you did sex for work, you were a sex worker, I remember that was the day when I was like, okay, I want to know more, but how do I ask?
Sure.
So tonight I'm going to ask all about it.
Be my guest.
All right. So before we start, what are you wearing? I always ask my guests.
Well, honestly, I don't sleep in any clothes, and I haven't in a really long time. But if I were to sleep in clothes, I figured this would be good for inspiring nice dreams.
I fear that too. And you're like not the only guest that admit that you don't sleep with clothes on. Pretty much most of my guests said that.
Yeah.
All right. Well, I like that. What is it called again? The thing you're on your T-shirt.
This is the eggplant emoji.
Eggplant.
Yeah.
But it's not really an eggplant, though.
I mean,
it's
in the eye of the beholder.
We know what it is. Well, Dale, so I want to say I think that what you did is fascinating. And I'm not trying to promote it in any case. I'm not trying to say like, hey guys, let's, go have sex and make cash for doing that. But I think it's just there's so much stigma about sex work.
Sure.
There are a lot of words that are related to the industry.
Sure.
Some words are, raise a lot of negative connotations, and some on the opposite, curiosity. So tell me more about how did you get into that?
It was like a time when I was, there was like another recession going on. I was unemployed, and I was facing like a rent bill and all the other bills. And somebody in one of those chat rooms offered me money. And at a certain point, I was like, at first he was very persistent, and he kept saying like, please come uptown, I'll make it worth your while. And I honestly was like not that interested in going because it was like the Upper West Side and I lived in the East Village. It was like too far. But, at a certain point I thought like, this is my best option for making rent this month. So I did go up and meet that guy, and he was pretty cool, and I gave him what he wanted, and he gave me a stack of bills, and I went back to my East Village apartment, able to pay the rent, and had a business plan.
I really hope that, sorry, Dora, I really hope that it's not going to trigger nobody right now, because I feel like a lot of us are dealing with paying rent, like rent bills, and recession coming up.
Absolutely.
So
I
feel like sex work's going to be like the new industry.
Well, I mean, it's been a recourse for a lot of people, and you talk about at the top of your show, you talk about marginalized groups. I mean, when you talk about sex workers, most of the people who are hiring, not all of the people, but most of the people who are hiring are men. And for the gay sex workers, it's guys, gay guys, usually, some straight guys performing that service. And then for straight guys, it's women performing that service. And it's a lot of queer people, and it's a lot of people of color, and it's a lot of trans people. So I'm not specifically representative of a sex worker because I'm a guy. There's far more women. I'm somebody who can speak to it because it's way in my past and I'm on to other things. But lots of people who are actively engaging in sex work don't have the luxury of going on a show and saying, yeah, that's me. They have to keep it, keep from disclosing it. That's like that's half their life is keeping it undercover.
Is that how it was for you back then?
It honestly wasn't that hard for me to stay undercover. I mean, I had like a cover story. Like I told people I was doing freelance event work. And I actually did some of that work during the time. So it wasn't that much of a stretch. But it is like an isolating process because, at least the way I practiced sex work, it was like hours alone in front of a screen, just waiting for a ping. And then when you did go to meet somebody, it's usually one-on-one or sometimes two-on-one. And you're kind of in a performative role, so you're not really like deeply connecting with those people. I mean, there is some connection, but...
So it's a lonely job?
I would say it's isolating. Like a lot of work. Like there's a lot of work today that is primarily like people, especially right now with like COVID, people are like home on their screens for hours at a time and that's their work. Or maybe a couple of phone calls. Or maybe a couple of, video chats.
How long were you engaged in this occupancy?
I would say it was my full-time work for 3 years. I supported myself and, I made good money and I, paid the bills and paid off some debt. And then I wound up getting offered a corporate job with one of New York's largest real estate companies. And at the time I was like, it was a good salary, but it was a pay cut for me. But it had all those benefits, like it was during the day and it was like, with other people and it was, had health benefits and a 401k. I certainly wasn't getting those as a sex worker. So I took the leap and entered like corporate work. And and I feel like a lot of the things I learned doing sex work were like relatable skills that I brought to that job. So.
Like what skills?
I mean, like I had a lot of like one-on-one time. I developed a lot of like, I would say that, even though it was like you're giving people a kind of performance, you're giving people a kind of ideal, you're still you're entering a relationship with them, even if it's transactional. And I had a lot of regulars. Like the secret to my kind of success, such as it was as a sex worker, was having regulars. It wasn't like new people every time. It was like people who knew me and called me again and again, whether it was like once a week or once a month or once every few months. And because for me, like thinking about all the risks that are out there, like, stings that were happening that were being conducted by the NYPD, for example, or just like the unknown.
Like what was happening? What were the risks of that job?
I mean, the main risks of doing that job were like, obviously, because it was like not predictable, it was not making enough money. The risks of doing that job, I was, obviously you're having like, I didn't have like a lot of health issues, thankfully, while I was doing that job. So that was a plus, but that is a risk that you have to, be mindful of. But I think and there were entrapments, like sting operations going on with the NYPD that I would hear about from other sex workers. So that was the biggest risk. And then also just the unknown factor of like, if you're meeting someone new, is it somebody that you can, trust?
Would you say that minorities that we talk about in daily life, such as LGBTQ, people of color, immigrants, would you say that in sex industry, those minorities are not as much minorities anymore, and there are just as many of them as, or if not more?
I think they're represented in large numbers for different reasons. So for immigrants, for instance, they may not have quote, legitimate job opportunities presented to them. And sex work is obviously an underground kind of work that they might be able to do more readily than getting a quote unquote legitimate work. For women, it might be like, the recourse might be like, should I, get this minimum wage job flipping burgers and be disrespected all day and not make enough money to support myself? Or should I work at a strip club and take home enough money to live on? For people of color, it might be the same thing where they're denied certain opportunities for employment and it becomes like the next best option. So I do think that, and for queer people as well, like, and certainly, you know, trans activists will tell you that sex work is often the best option for trans people to function in the world because they're denied so many other opportunities.
That's a good point, and I definitely know, and I had an episode with a woman transgender experience, and we talked about how many transgender people unfortunately are in the sex industry, and that's a good point, they don't really have a choice.
Yeah.
And here's what I really want to talk to you about as a representative, as a sex worker activist, as a former hustler. My question, and something that I personally want to find out and know, is sex work something that people do because they have no choice? They have immigrants that have a paperwork or etc. Or is it a mindset?
I think it's different for everyone. I mean, it's a question about agency and also like economic opportunity, right? So for me, it did come at a time where like a lot of options had shut down because between the recession and being like, you know, losing a business over like the real estate environment in New York City. But it was work that I felt gave me agency. Like I enjoyed the work. Even when I wasn't enjoying the work, I enjoyed it overall because I felt like it gave me like agency over my life, and I was able to like, you know, pay bills and save money and have time for other things. And one of the things that I did, which kind of led to me becoming a writer, is I kept a diary the whole time I was doing sex work, mainly so I wouldn't lose my mind doing it. Like it kept me sane to write about it and to like record. Like I would keep a diary. Like I would record. I kept a spreadsheet and I kept a diary. Like I tracked what my career as a sex worker was about, and so for me that was really important. It was like integral to like keeping sane through it all. It didn't really take me personally to any dark places. I mean, I certainly had some like bad dates and some unpleasant situations arise. Not that many. Like on the whole, it was something I came through like feeling pretty empowered about.
Like what situations? What situation were?
What was a bad situation?
Yeah, what are the bad situations?
I had a situation like probably the worst situation that I got myself into was like I went on a call with somebody who lived in an apartment building where you had to like show ID and sign in,
Mm-hmm.
and it was like government, like you know, federal, I guess some kind of like supportive housing, and this person, I mean, there was a lot of drug use involved, which I normally strayed away from, but this person basically tried to like cheat me out of my pay. And I wound up like marching him down to the ATM, and you know, it turns out he didn't have any money in his ATM, and he threatened me because, you know, he knew like my actual name, like my government name, and had the ID at the front desk of his building. So we got into a kind of standoff, and I wound up walking off with his wallet, and then he called the police on me, and then I went to the police. Anyway, it all resolved in the end, and actually that person wound up getting sober as a result of my interactions, at least for a time, and he eventually did pay me back. But it was like a very tense situation, like because he knew my real personal details, and he like had threatened to call the police on me.
So basically, the bad situation is simply when the clients did not want to pay you.
I mean, I think for me, like I was actually sober when I was a sex worker, so I think that naturally kept me out of a lot of bad situations because I did not engage with drug users. And I think, unfortunately, a lot of harm can come to people when they enter into, to me, it's a very volatile situation to be in a room alone with a stranger who's on drugs.
I would say.
Yeah, it's unpredictable at the very least. So I think I forestalled a lot of that danger by not participating in that kind of sex
Let me
work.
ask you a personal question, something that is just my curiosity. How do you have sex with a person that you've never met before, and I'm assuming that most of the times you're not even attracted to, like physically or sexually?
Yeah.
How do you forcefully, how do you have sex with that person?
I mean,
how did that work for you?
The cash certainly helps. But I think I was able to find, I said this at one point when I was actively doing the work, I think I found something to love about all of my guys. Like, there was, I don't think it's like, oh, I think, there's a kind of like, for one thing, you're there because they desire you. So like, if you're feeling desired, that can be a turn on in and of itself. Even if I'm purely turned on by their desire for me, not necessarily what I desire of them.
That's an interesting point, but let me ask you something. Would you say that in normal life or outside sex work life, is sex something for you that, how often do you have sex, or would you say you're a sexaholic? Is that something that...
I don't think I'm a sex addict. I mean, I enjoy sex and I have a fair amount for, for somebody my age, I guess. I mean, I'm married. I'm in a stable relationship, and we have like our kind of rules and boundaries around that. I'm not sure my husband would appreciate me talking about our personal relationship that much, but anyway, we are sexual beings, and and we respect each other's boundaries and have set some boundaries for each other, and and I feel like sex work gave me a healthier relationship to sex because I had the agency to like do what I was doing. Also, I learned a lot. There was like a lot of on-the-job learning because like, I would get a lot of calls for like kinks and fetishes, and prior to like doing this job, I really didn't have any kind of like, like advanced interactions with these kinks and fetishes, and I would be like called upon to like, engage in this kink, and I'd have to like look it up and then like go into it. So to me, there was like a lot of on-the-job learning, and I can, speak pretty reasonably intelligently about the whole like panoply of like kinks and fetishes that people enjoy.
And here comes the most interesting part for me. So I think you're fascinating because of the experience, the work experience that you had as a sex worker, as escort. I think it's, how many people do you know who did that or who do that, especially who can openly talk about that in an intelligent, sober way. And on top of that, I mentioned in the beginning that you are a writer and you write about sex work.
I do.
And you know better than anyone about that, since you did it, and you did it, without alcohol or drugs. You were completely sober, so you knew what you were doing, how you were doing. So tell me about your books. And I see you brought some bedtime stories for me tonight.
I have a copy of my book, Worker Names.
So can we show it a little closer?
Yeah, Worker Names.
So what is it called again?
It's called Worker Names.
Okay.
This is a trio of short stories that I submitted to this publisher. The name of the publisher is Gertrude Press, and they're like an LGBT imprint. And every year they suspended it this year because of COVID, but in years past they've done contests, like writing contests. And if you win, they publish your book. So I entered the fiction contest in 2018 and won, and this book is the result of that. The person who judged the entries, his name is Brontes Purnell, who's also a writer and a performer out on the West Coast. And I really love the way the work they did in publishing it, because we wound up getting permission from the estate of the photographer Alvin Baltrop, who is a a queer photographer in the 70s who photographed like the cruising activities of the West Side piers in New York City.
So what is the book about?
The book is a trio of short stories that are all about sex work, but they're each about
Is that
different.
biography?
I mean, some of the things that are in the stories happened to me, and some of the things are like it's part based on true stories and part invention. The first story is pretty much true to life. It's about like a kind of trick gone wrong, and it's like sort of a recovery story. Not the recovery story I just told you about, a different one. And the second one is about my friendship with another guy who was kind of like one of my like friends and mentors in sex work, Dean Johnson, and who passed away in 2007. And the third story is a kind of like a reckoning of like two old frenemies who like meet up again in a country house in the summertime in Vermont, and like.
Well, don't give up the story, but tell us. So what do you write in the story? So what should we expect in your books, in your stories? Is it graphic, sex, work?
I mean, there's definitely sexual content, but it's not erotica. It's like it's literary fiction that covers the topic of sex work. And my goal with this was to
the life of sex workers, basically.
Well, my goal was this: sex workers are represented in fiction sometimes by people who are writing about them who don't really know a lot, and they become a kind of caricature. Often in films, sex workers are represented in this caricature way or villainized. We can look at American Gigolo for an example. So I wanted to write from the sex worker's point of view and present them as a character in American fiction. So that was my goal with this little book.
So could you just briefly show the other books to us as well? So your goal is to write about the sex worker and represent. So if you were to describe to me as a writer, a sex worker as a inner world or what's going on, what is the life of a sex worker? What's a sex worker is like? What should we know about sex workers or could you break some stereotypes for us?
I mean, I would say that there's a lot of different experiences of sex work. And by the way, I think we need to establish that we're talking about like
Escort.
Well, no, we're talking about like people who are doing sex work of their own accord. They're not being coerced. They're not being trafficked. They're adults participating in sex work of their own volition and will. Whether that's a stripper, whether that's an escort, whether that's a cam girl, or like somebody who works in a house of domination, or somebody who works in porn. Because right now, we're in this environment politically and socially where there's a lot of attention paid to people who are being trafficked.
Yes.
Like sex trafficking, especially young people. And we need to make that distinction that we're not talking about anybody who's being coerced. We're talking about adults who are making decisions about what they want to do with their own bodies and what they want to do to earn their keep, to earn their living. So I would say there are many different experiences of that,
yes.
but this is the most common misconception, this kind of conflation of adult consensual sex work and the idea of trafficking. I mean, I think trafficking is real and I think it's horrible, but I don't think it applies to a lot of us. And I think there are forces like political forces and moralistic crusades that want to see us all as victims. And I don't think we're all victims or victimized in the way that they would describe.
I'm just trying to summarize. So from what I gathered from your experience, your story, a sex worker is a person who lives an isolated lifestyle, who is doing this for money because most of the times it's just, for economic situation pushes you to do so. And sex work can teach you sex experience that will benefit in your future love life. That's what I gathered. So it's like
Well, I would say that's not too far off. I would say like sex work isn't by necessity isolating. It can be isolating. Certainly the stigma can be isolating. Like I've been told, like when I was actively doing sex work, I was definitely told on a few occasions, like I couldn't possibly date a sex worker. My current relationship, I was very open about it, and he was accepting after a time. So he's like a rare good guy. So I think there is the stigma is isolating, but also the work can be isolating.
Right.
I also relate it a lot sometimes to like, an athlete or a dancer. Like there's usually only so much time you can do it for, even though I give props to those 50 plus sex workers out there. But for a lot of us, we feel like after a certain time, like when I was doing sex work, I was actually in my late 30s, and I felt like an old man in the field because most of the guys were a lot younger. Right. But I think it's definitely diversified since then.
Well, Dale, unfortunately, we need to go to bed, and but it's been fascinating. I'm glad that I got to talk to you, and once again, for me, meeting someone, because as a person, as an average person, I do have a little bit of stigma. I do have some stereotypes. I do have some maybe negative connotation with sex work and sex workers. But when I meet people in the industry like you and I talk about that, it goes away. And that's why I'm doing this show, because personally for me, when I meet people who I feel like we need to raise awareness, once I get to know you and hear, it comes to mind, I realize that it's all just fine. It doesn't matter if you're a sex worker, if you're not a sex worker, if you love sex, if you don't love sex. It doesn't matter. As long as you're not hurting nobody, as long as you're loving life, as long as you're happy, I choose to be happy for you. And I'm happy that we're friends, and I'm happy that I know you. And I think you're fascinating, and what you've done is fascinating. And the most beautiful part about it is that you wrote about it. So people who want to know more about sex work and sex workers can read Dale Corvino's books and articles and find out all about sex work that you want to know, right?
I'm glad I was able to help today.
You definitely helped me.
Good.
Well, anyways, have a good night.
Yeah, thank you for having me here.
Thank you for coming. Good night, everyone. Good night, Dale.
Good night.